Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. I'm Mark Purcell. I am the Deputy Director for Research and Collections at Cambridge University Libraries. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Liberation Lecture. The origins of this lecture series lie in the wonderful Liberation collection, the fantastically generous gift of Sir Charles Chadwyck-Healey. And just to say a little bit about that, an extraordinary collection of French books, meticulously collected using French national bibliographies and other sources to be an almost comprehensive record of material produced in print in France in the period immediately up to and immediately after the liberation in 1944. And this is one of a series of lectures which previously had been directly inspired by that collection, very generously sponsored by Charles Chadwyck-Healey, for which warmest thanks. This year, however, it felt right to look beyond France and to reflect together on themes of occupation, resistance, and liberation following the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's a great honour to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Rory Finnin, who is Associate Professor of Ukrainian Studies here at Cambridge and the former head of the Department of Slavonic Studies, to speak on the topic, as you will see on the screen, Volia, defiant freedom and liberation at the centre of Ukraine's national identity. I'd like to wind up, before inviting Rory to speak, by thanking three people or groups of people. First of all, again, to Charles Chadwyck-Healey for his ongoing support of the UL, the collection, and of this Liberation Lecture. Of course, to Professor Finnin, and we look forward with great interest to what you're going to say. And finally, on a cold, wet day in the sixth week of a busy Cambridge term, to you, our audience, and with a particular welcome to any Ukrainian colleagues who are here today. I should perhaps also note that the lecture will be recorded and will be on the library YouTube channel, and it will also be on the channel with Ukrainian subtitles, which we hope may be useful to some prospective members of the audience. But please, could I ask you to welcome Rory Finnin?
Thank you, Mark, so much for the kind introduction. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Wonderful. I'd like to join you in thanking Charles Chadwyck-Healey for making this event possible, the Chadwyck-Healey Charitable Trust, particularly for availing us of these insights from the Liberation Collection, this remarkable corpus of verse and prose that I think is a very stirring reminder of the power of literature to speak back, to talk back, respond to the violence of war, and to articulate new visions of freedom. And I'd also like to thank Francesca Harper, Mel Bach, and the entire team at Cambridge University Libraries, not just for your warm hospitality today, but your warm hospitality every day. You drive research in this place, it goes without saying. And of course, I'd like to thank my friends, my loved ones, and my colleagues from Ukraine, in Ukraine. Thank you for the privilege of learning from you, of being able to teach Ukrainian literature and culture at this institution, particularly now. Дякую, друзі, за довіру. Я вважаю це за честь. Все буде Україна. Дякую вам. Today, I'd like to begin with a scene of liberation, a scene of only days ago, when the Ukrainian armed forces arrived in Kherson, a key port city where the Black Sea meets the Dnipro River. The response from the people of Dnipro to the entrance of Ukrainian troops was jubilation. And in this scene from CNN, you'll see the reporter Nick Robertson experiencing this jubilation firsthand and getting swept up in it.
And what now? What are your hopes now? You have liberation and freedom. What are your hopes?
We feel free. We are not slaves. We are Ukrainians. We are proud of it. Yes, I agree with Julia. Yes. Yes, I agree.
It's celebration. People. Liberation looks like, this is what liberation feels like.
This is what liberation looks like. This is what liberation feels like. But liberation from what? We are now 9 months into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We are now over 8 years into Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. What we are witnessing, and we need to be crystal clear about this, what we are witnessing is Europe's largest country seeking to destroy Europe's second largest country, to destroy its culture and identity and anyone who embraces them. This is liberation, therefore, from Russian occupation that aims at genocide in Ukraine, a fact that is now, I think, blindingly and shockingly obvious. It needs to be cited in every news dispatch and every analysis of this war, because we have tragically, gruelingly abundant evidence of Ukrainians targeted and killed and tortured for who they are. And we have no shortage of moments in which Russian officials and figureheads, particularly on Russian state television, have not only publicly announced repeatedly their intentions to destroy, in whole or in part, the Ukrainian people, to eliminate a freestanding Ukrainian national identity, and to forcibly deport and assimilate millions of Ukrainians, especially children. More than that, they have openly applauded their efforts to do so, from former President Dmitry Medvedev to bureaucrats like Maria Lvova-Belova, who is head of the so-called Presidential Commission for Children's Rights. They award medals to soldiers responsible for the massacres in Bucha, Irpin, Izium. They could not be clearer about their objectives, and we should be crystal clear too. So facing this reality, Ukrainians in Kherson, in this remarkable moment of television, sing. They respond to liberation, or vyzvolenia in Ukrainian, by spontaneously singing their national anthem, much to the amazement of Robertson, who understands its message, if not its words. This anthem is not a triumphalist hymn to Ukraine. It is not pomp and patriotic bluster about a state and its greatness. It is a song about surviving, about hanging on. Ще не вмерла Україна. Ще не вмерла Україні ні слава, ні воля. Ще нам, браття українці, усміхнеться доля. I find it hard to actually say the words because I'm compelled to sing them. Ukraine's freedom has not yet perished, nor its glory. Fate, fellow Ukrainians, will smile on us once more. So this is a hymn about the power and promise of defiant freedom, of freedom against odds, or what Ukrainians refer to as Volia, a key word in the national anthem's opening lines. And as you can see, the root of the word vyzvolenia, or liberation, is Volia. The viz, for those of you inclined to linguistics, the viz prefix here is actualizing the root of the word here. So we have liberation, or quite literally, voliafication. Volia is a concept so tied to the people of Ukraine that we even have a special word for it, volia-любність, volia-любність українського народу, or the volia love of the Ukrainian people. Volia is a concept so embedded in Ukrainian culture and society that some even muse that the state emblem, the trizub or trident, which was discovered on coins in medieval Kiev 1,000 years ago, some muse that even this ancient symbol of the trident encodes the concept and the word volia in its very contour and form. Now, those of you who have studied Slavic languages or speak Slavic languages or are studying Slavic languages, and Godspeed to you, you are likely aware that I am wading very casually into very turbulent pools of terminological chaos. Because definitions of freedom and of liberty in the English language are complex enough. We'll get to that in a second. But Volia and its companion/competitor concept, svoboda, which also means freedom, are particularly fraught, tangled, and knotted. These are terms shared by both the Ukrainian and Russian languages, but they're understood, as we'll see, much differently. Volia even has its own entry in the lexicon of untranslatable words, edited by the philosophers Barbara Cassin and Emily Apter. But actually, this is somewhat misleading because Volia is not untranslatable. If anything, it is too translatable. Because depending on the context, Volia in Ukrainian can mean volition or will. It can mean desire. But its most salient spiritual meaning for Ukrainians is defiant freedom, which is in stark contrast to the aggressive, unrestrained id of freedom that's very common to the Russian usage of the term. The Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson is very helpful here. So in his seminal work of 1991, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, Patterson speaks of three very fundamental, very abstract conceptualizations of freedom. Personal freedom, the freedom of an individual to do what he or she likes as long as it doesn't impinge upon the freedom of others. Civic freedom, the freedom of individuals to gather, orchestrate their own governance and political organization. And what he calls sovereign freedom, the freedom of others to rule and to conquer and to wield power and authority over others. So this last concept of freedom is the freedom of the colonizer, of the tyrant, of the criminal. So we might think of Volia in this Ukrainian sense as the fourth concept of freedom that Patterson just doesn't have time or scope to address. Because for Ukrainians, Volia is the freedom that makes personal and civic freedom possible. It's the freedom that stands up to these aggressions of what Patterson calls sovereign freedom. Volia is the freedom that fights back. It is by nature under pressure, perpetually aware that its opposite or antithesis, nevolia, slavery or servitude, can emerge at any time. In other words, Volia is never given. It is the freedom you fight for, the freedom of individuals and groups to conceive of freedom as a value in the first place, and despite the odds, to reach out and claim it for oneself, or as the case may be, to claim it back for oneself. And I say claim it back because there's an entire history in the term Volia. You can sense it in its four letters. And it's a history of an experience of freedom lost in the past, but somehow within grasp in the future. Old Ukrainian folk wisdom gestures to this history in proverbs and aphorisms, recorded throughout the 19th century, last decades as well, of the 18th century, and compiled in collections like this one, edited by Opanas Markovich, who is a member of the so-called Brotherhood of Cyril and Methodius, the husband of Maria Volinskaya, who was also the pro-stylist Marko Vovchok. These maxims often very indirectly, very obliquely allude to occupation and dispossession that seizes freedom from underneath your feet. Na чужому полі не матимеш волі. On foreign soil or in a foreign field, you will have no freedom. Now, Ukraine is very likely a country that has been subject to the most sustained disinformation campaign in modern human history. You may think I'm exaggerating. I contend I'm not at all. And so it's worth us actually taking stock of the history behind such sayings at this time. So when Markovich and his colleagues were transcribing folk songs, folk tales, and folk proverbs, they were doing so at a time when much of the land of today's Ukraine was being slowly, progressively absorbed into the Russian Empire as a colonial possession. Remember that until the 17th century, nearly all the territory of today's Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That is, it was part of a Polish sphere of influence. Prior to this point, for over 3 centuries, the peoples we now call Ukrainians and Russians traveled in different political and cultural orbits altogether. In the 18th century, Ukrainians enjoyed in fits and starts significant autonomy in the Russian Empire, and European readers learned of Ukraine's wealth, learned of Ukraine's freedom, learned of Ukraine's dynamism in rich travelogues like this one by a certain Joseph Marshall, whose reflections, when we read them closely, rightly intimate that freedom's days are numbered in Ukraine. Quote, "The old inhabitants of the country," referring to Ukraine here, "were very free and had a great equality among them. And fortunately this continues, though in subjection to Russia. Most of the peasants are little farmers whose farms rather are their own, with 10 times the liberty among them that I saw anywhere else in Russia," unquote. Marshall's actual identity has been subject to a lot of debate over the years, but this description of Ukraine was not uncommon. It was in keeping with a great deal of writing and research that appeared at the time. It was published particularly in the 18th century, and even well before the 18th century, preceded by works like the 17th century description of Ukraine by the French military engineer Guillaume Beauplan. When one thinks about the description of Ukraine by Beauplan, when one thinks about this volume, this travelogue by Marshall, we begin to understand that European readers in the 17th, 18th centuries knew more about Ukraine on its own terms than we do now. Not unlike Marshall, Beauplan once observed that Ukraine was so abundant in natural resources that peasants themselves didn't know what to do with all the crops that they had. He referred to what is known as chornozem, the rich, fertile black earth that has made Ukraine the so-called breadbasket of Europe. So at times his narrative is patronizing, particularly relative to his representation of the peasantry, but his maps are exquisite. And you've had at least a few seconds here to look at this map. It may look a bit confusing. Can anyone tell me why? It's upside down. It's upside down. Very good. So, very good, everyone. North is on the bottom. South is at the top. So let's flip it. And when we overlay a contemporary map of Ukraine, you can see that Beauplan, 400 years ago, situated and positioned Ukraine's contours and boundaries wonderfully. We could use this map to travel through Ukraine today. Fast forward to the 19th century, and we see by this point Ukraine's freedom and autonomy well under the boots of the troops of the Russian Tsar. And so this nostalgia and thirst for Volia accordingly is building in intensity before a serf who is jotting verse in the corner of sketches and drawings changes everything. And the name of this serf is Taras Shevchenko, the spark and flame of modern Ukrainian culture, a man referred to by the contemporary Ukrainian author Andrei Kurkov as the Dalai Lama of Ukraine. And I like the description. He's a man born in 1814 who deserves his own Hollywood blockbuster. A serf who became a painter who became a poet, and a poet who endured imprisonment and exile to become the voice of a people. Over on the left here you see Shevchenko's self-portrait of 1840. On the right, an image from Borodyanka in the region of Kyiv. This statue was shot in the head. As you can see here, Ukrainians have bandaged it symbolically. It's a very touching story of an 11-year-old boy who endured the horrors of Russian occupation. He didn't speak about his own experience. The one thing he couldn't get his head around was why they shot the statue of Taras Shevchenko. So Americans like me can be prone to effusive description. I'm very aware of this. So it's very difficult to overstate how significant Shevchenko is for Ukrainians across the country, across the centuries, and across the globe. Let me show you some examples. Here is a photo of a demonstration of Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, in the region of Sumy, in 1917. And what they're doing is that they're celebrating the emergence of the Ukrainska Narodna Respublika, the Ukrainian People's Republic, in 1917, which, by the way, in 1918, the following year, received international recognition as a sovereign, independent state. Note at the center of the photograph the portrait of Shevchenko, and note as well the flags at the back. The one I've circled there, Zemlya i Volia, land and defiant freedom. Also the flag, Haj живе вільна Україна, let a free Ukraine live, long live a free Ukraine. So vilna or vilni, an adjective that's an outgrowth effectively of the concept and the word Volia. Here's another photograph from 1917. This one taken over 5,000 miles away from Sumy. It's a demonstration of Ukrainians in Vladivostok in the far east. Once again, it's difficult to see here in this photograph, but trust me that Shevchenko is presented right in the center. And these protesters were part of a larger movement that agitated for what eventually becomes known as the Ukrainian Secretariat of the Far East, which sought to govern what was often called Daleko Skhidna Ukraina, Far East Ukraine. This secretariat drafted a constitution. It sought to wield administrative control of a huge, vast territory. It mobilized Ukrainian troops on its territory, and it sought to engage in diplomatic relations with Japan in China. In other words, Ukrainian peasants sought to create a Ukrainian polity near the Sea of Japan. And that may sound to us like the punchline to a Soviet anecdote, but it's no joke at all. This part of the Russian Empire was perhaps the world's most challenging place for the Ukrainian national culture to flourish. But flourish it did, overcoming practical disincentives as well as legal restrictions, including the infamous M's Ukaz of 1876, which explicitly forbade the use of the Ukrainian language in the Russian Empire. So, to what can we attribute Shevchenko's far-reaching, lasting resonance? What is behind this legacy of a man who was born in bondage, who never achieved political power, who never occupied any political office, who never sat on a throne, who never even owned an estate? And above all, as all Ukrainians and students of Ukrainian know, what secures his status is, of course, his poetic gifts with the Ukrainian language. We can't delve into them here, very sadly. Suffice it to say that Shevchenko's poetic corpus is absolutely wonderfully alive. It's sonically, metrically adventurous, artistically well ahead of its time. When I read Shevchenko, I find his music perplexes me at times. It transfixes me. It gets stuck in the skull. It's very hard to shake. And his message, in a similar manner, has burrowed into the psyche of Ukrainians, and not only. Shevchenko stands astride Ukrainian culture because he's what we might call the Volia bard. He turns Ukraine from the name of a place with a distinct culture into an ethos and an idea that transcends territory, but always remains centered on this concept of Volia. I'll show you some examples. In his verse, he casts Ukrainian national identity not primarily a matter of ethnicity, so there's no talk in his poetry about an elect people, about genealogies that need to be restored and positioned once again in corridors of power. Instead, he casts Ukrainian identity as a matter of faith. Faith in Volia, which is set against twin systems of oppression, colonialism and serfdom. For Shevchenko, these systems of oppression turn people into slaves or cannon fodder, or at times both. So in doing all of this, he presents Ukrainian national identity as an anti-colonial alternative to aristocracy to his west and autocracy to his east, which is exactly why Crimean Tatars, ethnic Russians, Poles, and others join this Ukrainian national movement. So, Shevchenko, the Volia bard. Recall the lines of Ukraine's national anthem sung in Kherson. Ще не вмерли України, ні слава, ні воля. When these words were first published in the Kiev-based journal Meta, The Goal, in 1863, right before secret instructions were given to Russian imperial censors to forbid publication in the use of the Ukrainian language, these lines of what will become the national anthem were mistakenly attributed to Shevchenko, but we can understand why when we understand his role as the Volia bard. He died 2 years before the publication of Ще не вмерла Україна, as you see here. And on the left, you'll see he's also cited in an epigraph on the cover of the journal. В своїй хаті своя правда і сила і воля. In your own home, your own truth, strength, and defiant freedom. So you can sense a connection here to the folk wisdom I showed you earlier. На чужому полі не матимеш волі. They're speaking to a fundamental and very profound truth that our values need a home. This is very, very central to Shevchenko's artistic worldview. So the real author of these lines was Pavlo Chubinsky, a poet and an ethnographer who only months before the publication in this journal Meta was exiled to the north, to Arkhangelsk, near the White Sea, for, quote, harmful influence on the minds of the common people. Na umu prostoludinov. After Shevchenko's death, Volia becomes a steady fixture in Ukrainian literature and culture, and it's also an object of really colorful metaphorization in the tradition as well, over many decades. So the modernist Alexander Olais sings of the Sonce Voli, the sun of defiant freedom, and never wanted to pass up more metaphors when he could. He even writes of freedom as a bird, freedom as wind, Volia ptashka, Volia viter. Lesya Ukrainka in the early decades of the 20th century calls on Volia to flourish like a flower. Chai prosvita vasha volia jak ruta. Volodymyr Sosura evokes the star of freedom, Zoria Voli, and on. So you can see here defiant freedom as the refrain of Ukrainian culture. Yet interestingly, Shevchenko never plays with Volia and metaphor. We rarely see him subject Volia to any kind of association or comparison. For Shevchenko, Volia doesn't need another semantic point of reference. He lets it stand on its own. He believes it should stand on its own. If he does modify it in some way, he most often describes it as holy. Бо де нема святої волі, не буде там добра ніколи. На що з себе таки дорить? Because wherever holy freedom is absent or missing, there will never be kindness or goodness. Why delude ourselves? This is from a poem very importantly titled Tsari, the Tsars. But allow me to conclude with the most striking and even epical expression of Shevchenko's holy freedom or defiant freedom with this spiritual power, this spiritual uplift. Now, all grassroots movements seek freedom for their people. But Shevchenko does not confine his volyalubnost, his Volia love, to Ukraine alone. He celebrates and promulgates a defiant freedom for all oppressed peoples, particularly Muslim peoples, in the Caucasus, so Circassians, Dagestanis, Ingush, Chechen, who were resisting Russian colonizing forces in the middle of the 19th century. In a poem entitled Kavkaz, or the Caucasus, written in 1845, he gives these now epical colonial or anti-colonial watchwords to the world. Борітеся, поборете, вам Бог помагає. За вас правда, за вас сила і воля святая. Fight on, you will prevail. God is helping you. On your side is truth, strength, and holy freedom. Now, I wanted to show you a young Ukrainian man reciting these words, but there was a problem with this particular video. This is Serhiy Nihoyan, a young Ukrainian man of Armenian ethnicity who was raised in today's Dnipro, or formerly Dnipropetrovsk, in central and eastern Ukraine. He was, as it were, a sentinel on the barricades in the Euromaidan Revolution, or what becomes known in Ukraine as the Revolution of Dignity, Revoluция Hidnosti. Serhiy was the first of the so-called Heavenly 100. So he was the first protester shot by security forces, led by and ordered by the former president Viktor Yanukovych, who fled Ukraine to Russia in 2014 under cover of Russian military force. Ukrainians have largely forgotten about, and conveniently strategically, I think, forgotten about Yanukovych, but Nihoyan is honored and remembered throughout the country today. So these anti-colonial watchwords, Boritися, Poborite, fight on, you will prevail, during the Euromaidan Revolution were blazoned, as you can see here, on wooden shields used by protesters. These wooden shields contended first with rubber bullets, but then they contended, if you can believe it, with live ammunition. Boritися, Poborite, every Ukrainian hears these words and feels these words particularly keenly right now. But interestingly, in Shevchenko's poem, these words are not addressed to Ukrainians per se. They're actually addressed to the Chechens, the Circassians, who are fighting Russian aggression in the 1840s. So take that in for a moment. This is Shevchenko's deft sleight of hand. His expression of this consolidating power of holy freedom is a message for Muslim peoples, internalized as deeply intensively foundational by the people of Ukraine. So it's an expression both national and international. It's local and global. It's a source code for an ethics of liberation that knows no political, religious, or ethnic boundaries, but also does not efface them either. So only weeks ago, Ukrainian soldiers in the Kharkiv Oblast effectively rescued this ethics of liberation in a fashion that is almost mythical. You couldn't make this up. As with Kherson only days ago, these soldiers were liberating the city of Balaklia, which is situated between Kharkiv and Izium in the east. And they were removing a Russian propaganda billboard hastily posted sometime in early March. This is a billboard that is pushing a violent rhetoric of assimilation. It means we are one people with Russia. This is a refrain of someone like Vladimir Putin and others who think like him. And interestingly, when they say this, that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, they never use a term for that one people. They don't speak of Russians and Ukrainians as Eastern Slavs or so-called Slavic brothers, which of course is its own kind of myth. What they mean is certainly not that Russians are Ukrainians. They mean that Ukrainians are Russians, they just don't know it yet, or they've forgotten. So this is a violent rhetoric of assimilation. And when these Ukrainian soldiers tore this billboard down, not knowing what would lie beneath it, they were amazed and very staggered by what they discovered. As you'll see, one of them is literally breathless.
Yeah. Слава Україні! Слава Україні! Героям слава! Вірить на суддя, пішов. Да, дома! Іван слава сині гори, кривою путні. Іван рицарі великі, Богом не забудьте. Борітеся, поборете, вам Бог помагає. За вас правда, за вас сила і воля святая. Тарас Шевченко!
So beneath this Russian propaganda billboard was Shevchenko's message of comfort and solidarity with those enduring occupation, those needing liberation. That a people resisting colonialist aggression have defiant freedom, holy freedom, on their side. So this is a moment of a rather quizzical kind of liberation. It's a moment in which Volia, freedom itself, is excavated and rescued, and in a word, truly freed. It's a moment in which literature, literally, figuratively, is liberated. And in being liberated, this literature immediately speaks to and advances this cause of liberation. Again, a cause of liberation that is not only national, but universal. So this moment, which has gone viral online, has caused us to weep complex, happy, sad tears. This moment makes clear that the resistance of the Ukrainian people is much more than their own righteous self-defense, their own legal self-defense against colonialist conquest and aggression. As we just saw, this fight involves the liberation of the very idea of freedom itself, a value, of course, we purport to uphold. Their fight, in other words, is our fight. Their security is our security, a security that is geopolitical, certainly, but also ontological. So, despite our own challenges, as winter approaches, as this horrific war drags on, we cannot afford to lose focus, become distracted by what is often referred to as Ukraine fatigue, which is really Russia fatigue. 2 days ago, Russia unleashed a barrage of 100 cruise missiles against residential dwellings and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. 100 cruise missiles. And it barely broke our headlines here. When we understand the centrality of Volia to Ukraine's national identity, we can see that Ukrainians will defend themselves for as long as it takes. But we can also see why Ukraine can win, provided we do what is necessary to help them. With that in mind, I want to draw your attention to a list of vetted NGOs, grassroots groups in Ukraine, doing remarkable work to provide humanitarian relief to those who need it. That list can be found at ukrainianinstitute.org.uk. Please do, if you can, when necessary, avoid larger international NGOs that sometimes are just too big, too slow to assist people on the ground. All the organizations have been vetted by the Ukrainian Institute, our partners, as well as our own program here, Cambridge Ukrainian Studies. And if you're more technologically sophisticated than I am, you can even use this QR code and you'll be led to United 24, President Zelensky's global campaign for support of Ukraine. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.